So getting into Nomos, they've only been around for 30 years, but they're a pretty large brand. And, at first they used DTA movements, other manufacturers, because it's expensive to have your own in-house movement. And they really subscribe to that Bauhaus design language as they still do today. Most of their watches coming under 40 millimeters. Their first watch at 35 millimeters, which was a nice middle ground between a male and female, leaning watch. And I think that was refreshing by the fact that, the age they were going into was tending towards larger watches, and they just stayed in the bubble they thought was what they were, and it worked out. By 2005, they had their own in-house movements. They created the Alpha caliber, which was one of their longest running calibers, as well as the caliber that's in this watch here. And by 2014, they were completely in-house because they created their own, what's considered the Nomos swing escapement. So it's pretty cool. And they're actually one of the few brands that are still completely in-house. They're completely, not in-house, but they're completely owned by themselves. They're private. They're not owned to any company like Swatch Group or Richemont. They're just Nomos, and that's cool. To be an independent brand and have as much reach as they do is refreshing. Let's get into this watch a little. Let's take some dimensions. So we have a diameter of about 38.5. We have a lug-to-lug length of about 49 millimeters. We have a thickness of about 8.5 millimeters and a lug width of 20. So pretty good dimensions on this watch. It is more of the Nomos' modern sizing, if you could say that. More their smaller, more conservative dress watches come in at around 35 millimeters, and this one being at 38.5 is more of a crowd pleaser. It has a sapphire crystal on the front and the back of the watch. It has the Nomos in-house Alpha caliber, as you can see here through the closed case back, which has about a 43-hour power reserve. It's adjusted into 6 different positions, and it is obviously manual wind, as there is no rotor back here. So let's get into this watch's dial. So there's nothing overtly spectacular or groundbreaking in the dial here. It is very plain, other than the mix of Arabic and Roman numerals. We have a nice little pop of orange, which kind of Nomos strives to be a Bauhaus-inspired brand. They do very kind of minimal design efforts. They do clean, concise, and just pretty much minimalistic designs. But they try to bring a youthfulness and kind of a twist onto Bauhaus by doing such things as like this reverse California dial, pop of orange in the seconds hand, and the like that. So if we get into the dial a little more closely, you can see that the numerals are actually inlaid with this blue kind of coloration, which is the lume, and the outside is in a type of orangish color, the surround of the lume, to match the seconds hand, which I think is pretty nice. And as you can see, we have this kind of sometimes silver, sometimes white, sometimes slightly gray, changing dial, alternating numerals and indices, and a nice little minute track on the outer edge here. And as we get on a closer level of this dial, you can kind of see it's not just the plain white / silver dial that we were expecting. It has this type of metallic / alternating pattern to it, is what I would kind of describe it as. You can see there's light marks, there's dark marks, and it does have a very just fine, almost like a brushed metallic feel to it. It's nice that they kept the sub-dial in the exact same texture. They didn't do like any concentric circles or anything for that. It is a little bit sunken down in from the dial, but that's as far as the detailing really goes. You can see the bulbous quality of the numerals there, and the fact that they are done in that differentiating color. And you can see at this level better how that orangish color matches to the seconds hand. And another thing to note as we're on this macro level is there really isn't, at least to my eye and to my camera, any imperfection in this dial. The numerals are done and outlined very well, very cleanly. There is no imperfection in the dial texturing of itself, or the pattern rather. Nomos glass hute is really done, printed very well. No really blemishes on the hands themselves. Very nicely done, very polished, very silver, very reflecting of the light, as you can see as it catches. But yeah, as you can see, there's not a lot of elements to the dial, but they take the time to add tiny little details that come together to make the watch as a whole as it is. It's the slight outline of orange that you don't really notice, but it does play off the seconds hand and just come together to create a sense of, harmony within the watch's face. It's the puffiness of the markers that just raise off the dial and create a little bit of depth, even if you may not perceive it directly. This slight graininess, this alternating coloration of this somewhat metal-looking dial that just allows it to play with light and become different colors, have different sheens at different times. All these very, very fine details that just come together and create a watch which is just very well done with very little elements to it. And again, that bright popping seconds hand. As you can see, the Nomos has a pretty decent glow to it. It is nicely loomed. It has the indices, the numerals, the hands, all loomed. It would have been nice if they included some type of lume inside of the running seconds hand, but it is a dressier leaning watch. It's not necessarily needed. It does glow in this nice blue coloration, which I prefer definitely over the green type of super luminova. Very nicely done, very nicely applied. Another thing I would like to note is that basically the hands, the indices, the numerals, they're kind of all the same shade. They all have the same pretty much amount of lume put to them. So that's a nice detail, because sometimes you get those watches with very, very bright hands, very, very dim indices, and it looks odd. Sometimes the coloration is thrown off just when it's not even dark, when you're in the light and you can kind of see the lume applied to the hands made it a different color than the indices and whatnot. But again, lume done very nicely here. I relume it really quick and I'll compare it to the little Timex here. You can see that they're both very legible in the dark. Obviously the Timex has more surface area, so it'll look brighter. I think to my eyes it actually looks pretty much the same in the type of light it's giving through. It just is a lot larger of an area on the Timex. But yeah, very nicely done lume on the Nomos. It's not something they needed to do, but something that they did do, so kudos to them. Moving on to the case of the watch, something I did forget to mention earlier is that this is a 100-meter water-resistant watch, and it does not have a screw-down crown, so take it as you will, but that is the stated resistance. But moving on to the case, it continues the trend of minimalism. It is a completely polished case in all aspects. It doesn't have a lot of fancy segmentations, indents, chamfers, anything like that. You just have some nice long sweeping lugs here, which do curve down pretty nicely and actually extend just below the case back so that it'll wear well on the wrist. And got a nice little Nomos signed crown right there. If you can pick that up, a slightly domed sapphire crystal. And very nice knurling on the crown. It's very grippy, which is good because this is a hand wind watch, so that's something you're going to be doing a lot with the watch. So good thing that they've made it easy to do on this one. But overall, nothing too much spectacular about the finishing on the front of the watch, at least. It's all polished. It will definitely pick up scratches. It picks up scratches easily, which is somewhat of an annoyance, but it's going to happen. And if it's a polished watch, it's going to show even more than it would on a brushed one. Yeah, but looking at the overall finishing of the movement, you can see it is very, very finely done. For the price of around, on the used market around $1,200, but on the new market around $1,800, it still is pretty decently done. You have the nice bluing of the screws, the nice coloration, the difference in coloration between the blue and the reddish purple of the rubies. You have very much this rise and fall between the ridges of the striping that is very defined and something that sometimes is a little lackluster on the finishing of other watches, which is just nice. It's done to a level that, you know, they can be proud of. It's not just face value, it's something that actually took time, took effort, took machining to do, and they've done it well. One thing I will note is they just kind of stuck a smaller movement, you know, their alpha movement that they've had for probably going on about, I think it came out in 2005, so about 14 years now. They just took the smaller movement into a larger case. So you do get this kind of gap around the outside here, as you can see. You can even see the stem from the crown going in there a little bit, which is a little bit of a bummer, but you know, it is what it is. It still is a very nicely done movement, nicely decorated movement that we will zoom on in a second just to see some of the detail. And not much engraving on the back of the case. We can see this little tiny whale symbol kind of playing to the fact that it's not a brand that takes itself too seriously, but it's 100 meters water resistant, and the club and the reference number for the type of club it is. Last thing I did want to mention is the lug. I mean, the case itself is just very curvaceous. It has a very much sloping bell shape from the top into the bottom of the case. It very much does rely on the thinness of its dimensions. It is kind of just built to wear well close to the wrist and be kind of, in a way, I guess, unobtrusive. So speaking of how it wears, let's put it on the wrist. Earlier I was wearing my little Timex Snoopy. Now as you can see, as I was wearing the Snoopy previously, they are about the same size in diameter, but this one wears larger, and that's mainly due because it has a larger lug-to-lug distance. That is good news for people with larger wrists because it will have more of a stance on the wrist and allow it to feel like it has more presence than its dimensions would suggest. But on people like smaller wrists, or people like me with smaller wrists, it's somewhat of a bane because sometimes the distance might be too long for the wrists. Maybe you don't like how it looks proportionally with the dial to, length ratio. For me, I think it's kind of an acquired taste. For some straps, you can see even with this stock Nomos strap, there's going to be a gap in between the case, the case and the lugs here. So there's always going to be kind of a see-through element there that you don't necessarily get as much with other watches. That is kind of a culture shock. And you know, sometimes depending on how the watch is made, there can be such a thing when the lugs are too short. Sometimes the lug will flare out. Maybe there's not enough space to curve them down. It will rise too high off the wrist or not curve into the wrist. So I'm sure Nomos has its reasonings for making the lugs as long as making the lugs as long as they are, and it's kind of a common theme for them along most of their watches. So it's either something you're gonna love or hate, but for me, I don't think it's a deal breaker. As you can see, it just wears very flat on the wrist. It definitely does curve into the wrist. It is just very much an ergonomic, thought out case. So getting into some pros and cons of the watch, I think a pro is definitely the size. At 38.5 millimeters, it's not at all too large. So it will still fit on smaller wrists like mine, which is 6.5 inches. But for those with larger wrists, especially with the longer lug distance, it will still look both proportional, but also give that feel of a bigger watch. It's not their 35 millimeter watches that'll look too dainty on those with some larger wrists. So I think it's a good middle ground size, and I appreciate that. It's also very thin, so it's very comfortable. Under 10 millimeters, under 9 millimeters. It's really, really nice on the wrist. The movement is also definitely a pro. Not only is it in-house, which for some it's a pro, some they could not care less if it was an ETA as long as it works well. But it's nicely finished. It is been in production for over a decade at Nomos, so I'm sure they kind of know what they're doing in terms of servicing and all those kinds of things. And usually they run fairly accurately. And basically, it has 100 meters of water resistance. It's not something I would 100% trust because it's not a screw-down crown, and also it's a dressier leaning watch, so I'm not going to really go diving with it anyway. But it's there for ease of mind. Now, some cons of the watch, as it is a Nomos, kind of like the lugs, For me, they're not a huge deal, but on certain straps, there's that huge gap between the case and the strap. So sometimes certain combinations, certain things, it'll look awkward. But I've found personally, whenever I put it on a one-piece strap, like a Perlon, a NATO, what are those new straps called? The chevron straps, then it kind of gets rid of the gap and it looks more cohesive. So that's kind of the con taken away, but it still exists. Also, the fact that the case is all polished. I'm not in love with cases that are all polished, especially top portions of the case, like when you're looking down onto the watch. For me, just personally, I feel like it makes the watch look cheaper in some sense. Just not only is it easier to get scratched, scratches show more easily, and sometimes a watch is too shiny. With this watch in particular, there's no difference in finishings. There's no brushed sides. There's no alternation between brushed and polished finishes. It definitely is a cost-cutting measure, but it's also something that I would think would be a nice addition personally, but that's just me. Something that will be a little bit of a contention point for some people is the California dial. I don't mind it. I think it's unique, something that like differentiates the watch in a collection, but some people just don't really like the mix of Arabics and Romans, so if you don't like it, just don't get the watch. And one of my biggest cons for the watch personally is just the orange seconds hand. I know that it's playful. I know that it's kind of like their take on Bauhaus. It's something that brings it out of that mentality in a way. But I think if it was like a white seconds hand, or maybe a color that's like less particular, like a dark blue, something like that, I feel like it would just not pop out as much and also just match more. Sometimes when the second hands get hidden by one of the hour hands or minute hands, I just feel like, oh, the watch looks a lot better. It looks more cohesive. There's not so much difference in the colors on the watch. So personally, I would have liked to see it without the colored hand. But that's just my personal taste. Some people I know who own the watch love the fact that there's an orange hand on it. So it's really up to you. But overall, it's an amazing watch. It's really good value for money. I mean, especially at sub $2,000. If you get it used, you can actually find them around $1,000, if not less. So it's a cool watch. I mean, if you get it, I don't think you can go wrong. I've owned both the white dial here and the black dial, and I'd prefer, or not prefer, but I would say I'd recommend the white dial over the black dial, just because, again, there's a lot less color separations on the dial. So the white dial just looks more cohesive in its color palette, we'll say. But honestly, no matter which watch you go with, or really any Nomos watch in general, you're getting good value for money. You're getting cool German watchmaking from an independent brand, and you really can't go wrong. So hope you enjoyed the video. Hope to see you in another one.